Welcome to the Virginia Civics and Economics Lecture Series. At the end of each slide, there will be a 5-second delay. Use this time to complete your notes. When you are done, push play and move on to the next slide. This presentation will begin in 5 seconds. Welcome to Virginia Civics and Economics Lecture 1.10 on separation of powers, and it's time to finally talk about our federal government. You know, the one that we consented to in the United States Constitution? Well, before our founding fathers could set forth what that government would look like, they had to answer one basic question. How do we organize the Constitution? There's a lot of information in there. Well, here's how we did it. We started with articles. Those are the main parts of the Constitution, and then we had sections. Those cover specific issues within each article. So, for example, you already learned about Article 5. That's the main section on how to amend the Constitution. Today, we're going to talk about the first 3 articles of the Constitution, which set forth what our federal government looks like. And we start with Article 1, which is Congress. That is the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. These are the people who make the laws. Then we have Article 2, that's the executive or the President of the United States of America. That's the person who enforces the laws. And then we have Article 3, that's the courts. Those are the people who interpret the laws. Whoa, wait a minute. There's a lot of power in this triangle. I thought that we were trying to set up a limited form of government. Well, we were. So the question is, how do we keep our federal government from going beyond our consent? That's what we're going to look at today. And with that said, go to the next slide. You learned that we only consent to being governed under a limited form of government. Our consent only goes so far. So how far does our consent actually go? In order to understand how our government works as a whole, we need to first see how we limited the power of the government. Remember, always it's power to the people. We consented to be governed, and if the government goes too far, we can take that power back. Well, here's how we limited the power of government. We created separation of powers. The Constitution of the United States divides the government into 3 branches. And yes, you can actually think of separation of powers as 3 branches on a tree of government. Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is the executive, and Article 3 is the court. And we further define the powers of each branch. But here's the thing. Each branch of government must operate within its own power, and no branch of government is supposed to usurp or take the power of the other 2 branches. In other words, there's no jumping from branch to branch. Your branch of government needs to stay on your side of the tree, and the other 2 branches of government will stay on theirs. It's not enough to have separation of powers. We also need to have checks and balances. Each branch of the national government limits the exercise of power by the other 2 branches. What does that mean? It means this. Congress has the power to maintain a balance between itself, the executive, the president, and the courts. And the other 2 branches of government have that same power. So, no branch of government can become so strong that it actually takes over the government. Go to the next slide. Many Americans become frustrated when talking about our government. This should be easy, they say. Congress makes the laws, the president enforces the laws, and the courts interpret the laws. Why does our government run so poorly? The answer is that the founding fathers did it on purpose. They purposefully made the government inefficient, or so that it doesn't run well, in order to create a limited form of government. So before we can talk about what each branch does for us as citizens, we need to talk about how one branch of government keeps the other two branches in their place. And we start with the power of the legislature. The Congress checks the president when legislators do one of two things. The first thing has to do with making a law. Congress passes a proposed law and gives it to a president. The president either signs the proposed law and it becomes a law, or he says, no, I don't want to do that. Well, when that happens, Congress can override a presidential veto. That's when the executive does not allow Congress to enact a law. It requires a two-thirds vote in both chambers of Congress. They send a proposed law to the president says no, and if both chambers of Congress in a two-thirds majority say yes, it becomes a law. How hard is it to do this? Less than 10% of veto actions have been overridden. Less than 10% of the time can Congress tell a president, this is going to be a law even if you don't want it to be one. The second thing they can do is impeach and convict a president. They can remove a president of the United States from office. The House of Representatives begins with a committee hearing. That's several members of the House having a hearing, and then they bring the impeachment to the full House for a simple majority vote. If they vote yes, they've impeached the president. The Senate then conducts a trial, which is presided over by the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and they convict the president or remove him from office with a two-thirds majority. And there is no judicial review. The courts can't come in and say, well, Congress did it right or wrong. Congress does it any way they want. That Congress also checks the courts when legislatures do one of three things. The first thing goes like this. The President of the United States gets to decide who will be a member of the court, who will be a Supreme Court justice, who will be a judge in a federal court. But Congress has to consent. They have to say, we agree that this person should be in that job. Congress can confirm or refuse to confirm federal judges and justices appointed by the president. Once Congress refused to even conduct hearings or even discuss regarding the replacement of a Supreme Court justice based on the idea that it was a presidential election year. Congress can also impeach and convict judges and justices using the same process as set forth above for removing a president. And finally, Congress can override a Supreme Court decision with legislation. So let's say the Supreme Court says one thing and Congress doesn't like it. They can create a law that changes what the Supreme Court said. But it can only expand the rights of citizens, not go against the court's ruling. Go to the next slide. Congress represents the voice of the people. We elect our fellow Americans to represent us in Washington, D.C. as they create the laws that we will all live under. Because of this, Congress is powerful, but the other two branches are powerful as well. So let's talk about the power of the executive. The president checks Congress when the president does any of the following: proposes legislation or new laws to the nation, prepares an annual budget for Congress to approve. This is how much money we need this year to run the government. Calls a special session of Congress or delivers the State of the Union address. What is this? All of the members of Congress gather at the Capitol, and the president speaks directly to them on behalf of the nation. The president vetoes legislation passed by Congress if he or she does not agree with it. And finally, the president implements the law as he or she sees fit. This is called selective enforcement, and it is very controversial. So, veto of a bill is the most direct check by the president, but selective enforcement is the most powerful. The president also checks the courts when the president appoints the justices of the Supreme Court and all lower court judges. Go to the next slide. If you read Article 3 of the Constitution, the courts don't seem to have a lot of power. The federal courts here cases and controversies to settle constitutional issues. Well, what did the Constitution mean here? Or legal cases between citizens of different states. But then this guy shows up. His name is John Marshall, and he is a Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he's going to take that cases and controversies language and create two powerful checks in government. The court checks Congress when justices and judges declare laws unconstitutional. Congress, you just passed that law. That law goes against the United States Constitution, and we will not enforce that law in federal courts. And the court checks the president when justices and judges declare executive actions or the implementation of laws to be unconstitutional. Executive branch, what are you doing? You're trying to implement a law in a way that is unconstitutional, or you're supposed to be doing something and you're not. This is the check against selective enforcement by the president. So, this guy might have made the courts the most powerful branch of them all. Go to the next slide. There are a lot of different ways the Founding Fathers kept our government in check, made sure that we had a limited government. So once again, let's look at our federal government with Article 1 Congress, Article 2 the Executive, and Article 3 the courts, and let's visually draw out exactly what checks one branch has against the other. Let's start with Article 1 Congress. They can check Article 2, the president or the executive, by overriding a veto or impeaching and convicting a president. Article 1 Congress, they can check Article 3, the courts, by confirming or refusing to confirm justices or judges, impeaching or convicting justices or judges, or overriding a decision of the courts, but they can only expand the rights of American citizens. Now let's talk about the president. Article 2, the executive, has a check on Article 1 Congress by doing any of the following: proposing legislation, preparing a budget, calling special sessions, delivering the State of the Union, vetoing legislation, and implementing the law. The president's check on the courts is that the president gets to appoint justices and all federal judges. Finally, we have the checks from the courts, Article 3. The courts check Congress by declaring laws unconstitutional, and the court checks the president by declaring executive actions unconstitutional. It is a powerful triangle, but the Founding Fathers built it so that it goes against itself in order for us to have a limited government. That's it for this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class.